My partner and I have firm resolve. In United States public K-12 schools, the probable cause standard ought to apply to searches of students. We posit a cost-benefit analysis stressing the moral and constitutional importance of maintaining an educational system that does not discriminate. Contention 1, limiting racial bias. Subpoint A, the calculus of a search. Sarah Jane Foreman of the University of Detroit notes that under reasonable suspicion, anyone and anything can be viewed as suspicious, and so the exercise of discretion becomes particularly susceptible to racial bias and a subjective interpretation of behavior. As a result, students of color are more likely to be singled out than their white counterparts. The U.S. Department of Ed published evidence of disproportionate punishment, noting that while black students represent 16% of student enrollment, they represent 27% of those referred to law enforcement and 31% of arrests. Jason Nance at the University of Florida concurs with this conclusion, finding that the odds of a school employing mass searches of its student body without reason were 7.7 times greater for schools with higher minority population than for those with lower ones. Under probable cause, school officials are unable to justify a search without proper evidence. Subpoint B, internalized racism. Tiffany Lockett of California State University writes, African Americans characterize the use of unnecessary searches as harassment based on their belief of the police's unfavorable suspicion about the criminal propensity of African American male youth. Foreman examines the resulting mindset. As youth develop negative views of school and distrust of law enforcement that alienates them from mainstream society, increasing the lure of gangs and other antisocial groups. Not only do students become prone to gang activity, but Wesley Bryant of the Journal of Black Studies finds internalized racism is the most statistically significant variable of aggressive behavior, and more important than other factors like delinquent peers or even substance abuse. By limiting the ways in which racism manifests itself in the school, internalized racism will decrease. Contention 2, criminalization. Subpoint A, exacerbating future crime and increasing recidivism. Arthur Allen of the Washington Post writes, scientists have found that until a person hits their early 20s, the parts of their brain responsible for reasoning and judgment are still rapidly changing. The U.S. Supreme Court upheld in Roper v. Simmons that juveniles exhibit an underdeveloped sense of responsibility. We don't hold juveniles to the same disciplinary standards as adults to avoid punishment that stunts economic and mental growth. In the status quo, however, schools do not agree with this analysis. In 2014, the Department of Ed reports that 260,000 students were referred to law enforcement and 92,000 were subject to school-related arrests. This is critical because juvenile incarceration ruins teens' chances for reform. Joseph Dorrell of the NBER explains that by encouraging the accumulation of criminal capital and preventing school completion, juvenile incarceration greatly reduces future labor market wages and increases future criminal activity. He finds that those who are incarcerated as juveniles are twice as likely to go on to be locked up as adults. And Barry Holman of the Justice Policy Institute corroborates this, finding that the odds of reoffending increase 13.5 times for youth with a prior commitment. Subpoint B, probable cause decreases arrests. First, by decreasing the number of searches. Andrew Tassas of the Howard School of Law explains that since meeting a higher evidentiary standard, such as the one required by probable cause, can sometimes be difficult, fewer searches and seizures will occur. With fewer searches, fewer students will be found guilty of possession and thereby arrested. Second, by allowing for the suppression of evidence. Nance continues, because school officials need only show reasonable suspicion, they often present evidence to judges predicated upon bias that doesn't hold up under close inspection. Were the standard set to probable cause, such evidence would then be suppressed under the exclusionary rule, and the student would not be convicted. Subpoint C, decreasing dropout rates. Spencer Weiler of the Harvard Law Review finds that the most troubling consequence of increased searching is that students are less likely to graduate. Even if they aren't arrested, Robert Boffins of Johns Hopkins observed that a suspended student is a third more likely to drop out than others. And Paloma Esquivel of the LA Times notes increasing the graduation rate by 10% would result in a decrease in homicides and assault by about 20. Contention 3, empowering minority citizens. Foreman observes that the constant suspicion under reasonable suspicion pushes students into a defensive posture that hinders their ability to become active citizens. The impact is twofold. First, Foreman notes that the legitimacy of the law is decreased. Students turn away from civic institutions designed to help them, which range from participating in drug rehab centers or exercising their right to vote. By increasing government legitimacy, probable cause alleviates government mistrust. The second is bolstering constitutional rights. In West Virginia Board of Education v. Barnett, Justin Jackson warned of a system that results in youth discounting important principles of our government as mere platitudes. Fighting racism in the status quo starts with teaching students that their rights are inalienable. If we can stop unjust searches, we have a better chance of producing an informed citizenry less likely to allow the government to infringe on those rights. And for all of these reasons, we strongly urge a pro-val. Thank you.
Okay, opponents ready. All three judges and Anshul. Let's begin. Anshul and I negate the resolution, and contention 1 is putting schools under arrest. School resource officers, or SROs, are police officers employed in U.S. public schools. The NCES reports in 2015 that only 43% of public schools across the country employ SRO personnel. However, a switch to probable cause would force schools to strengthen the presence of SROs for 4 reasons. First is constraining teachers. The Rao of Harvard Law explained that in the status quo, police's role in schools has shrunken because school officials, like teachers and administrators, only need reasonable suspicion to search a student. However, switching to probable cause means that administrators will be restricted, increasing dependence on resource officers. Second is litigation costs. Hirschfield of Rutgers explains that after court rulings undermine the traditional authority of teachers and administrators, they become increasingly fearful of being sued. As a result, schools expand the roles of police and external security in school discipline to reduce their vulnerability to lawsuits. Third is legal ramifications. Pinard of Arizona Law explains that the probable cause standard requires school officials to act as agents of law enforcement. Consequently, he concludes that courts would require SROs to be actively involved in all student searches under probable cause. Fourth is the warrant requirement. The Cornell School of Law explains that search warrants are necessary to validate probable cause. This is important as Rosenblatt of the New York Court of Appeals explained that only police officers can execute search warrants. Thus, in order to conduct any searches, schools would need to employ SROs. Increasing SROs is problematic because SROs exacerbate youth criminalization. Nance of the University of Florida quantifies that schools with SROs have 1.83 times more referrals for low-level offenses than schools without SROs. This is because officers are obligated to make arrests, while teachers can choose if an offense is arrest-worthy. Put simply, offenses that were once a learning opportunity with a teacher now become a felony with an SRO. This is important because Lowson of the NEPC finds that 95% of referrals are due to offenses that do not involve school searches. Contention 2 is zero-tolerance policies. Zero-tolerance policies are disciplinary measures that mandate a predetermined consequence for a crime regardless of the circumstances, perpetuating criminalization. Unfortunately, switching to probable cause would exacerbate the effects of zero-tolerance policies for two reasons. First is pressuring administrators. From an administrative perspective, probable cause means less searches, giving the perception that more crime is going unhindered in schools. Problematically, the ACLU finds that during the 1980s, when certain school districts directly applied probable cause to schools, officials complained that the standard made it impossible to keep schools running smoothly and safely. Historically, Merkway of UMich finds that perception of fear in the short term in schools has led to increased security measures. As such, Teskey of Georgia State confirms that schools wrongfully see zero tolerance as a viable approach to creating safer classrooms. Empirically, Nagel of the University of Illinois finds that administrative decision makers compensate for low perceptions of punishment certainty with increases in punishment severity. Second is external influences. Blankenau of Wayne State writes a perceived decrease in school safety leads to parents and advocacy groups to pressure for and achieve stringent changes in disciplinary policy. In fact, the National Education Association found empirically that states are increasingly obligating school districts to involve parents in policy decisions. The impact of zero-tolerance policies in schools is feeding the school-to-prison pipeline. Due to its punitive nature, zero tolerance criminalizes students for minor infractions, which materializes, as Teskey furthers, that zero tolerance empirically increased referrals to the juvenile court by 1,248%, mostly for low-level misdemeanors. Azer of Brown quantifies that the incarceration of a child increases the likelihood that they commit a future crime by 67%, and according to Solomon of the NIJ, even those with minor criminal histories struggle for the rest of their lives to overcome the stigma against their character and employability, perpetuating a cycle of poverty and recidivism that sustains through generations. Overall, Arum of NYU writes that the expansion of student rights has historically increased the extent to which schools have relied on authoritarian measures, moving discipline from the schoolhouse to the courthouse. And for these reasons, we are very proud to negate.
You ready for cross?
Yeah, we're watching.
Water.
Will this one like?
Sure. Okay.
Do you want to take a breath?
Yeah.
So I just want to start off here on your first contention where you give us 4 reasons why SROs are going to increase.
Yeah.
Your first we focus strongly on teachers and the impact and the influence that teachers will have as a result of probable cause.
The first two.
The first 2 primarily,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Okay, are you aware of what qualified immunity is?
I know what qualified immunity is, but we would argue that, like,
So
under
wait.
wait.
Qualified immunity?
Qualified immunity basically says that, like, teachers, like, can't get punishment for these things.
Mm-hmm.
But what we would argue is that under probable cause, things like qualified immunity can go away.
Why so?
That's
an incredibly important part of raising the standard.
like, we can give you evidence that tells you that, like, a much clearer standard, like probable cause would be, what would happen is, with that clear standard, you take away qualified immunity. I can show you the evidence after crossfire, if that's fine.
Okay, we're gonna have to. That's gonna be heavily disputed. We'll have to.
Okay, all right. So,
Yeah,
like,
sure.
overall in the round, should we, like, be prioritizing keeping kids out of jail?
Of course, yeah, we agree with that, right? Of course, you're both impacting towards criminalization.
Yeah,
At that point, we're disagreeing about how we're getting towards that. Then, okay, let's go down to your next reasons then. Reason 4, you talked to us about the warrant requirement, right? The problem with this is, though, that we shouldn't be seeing warrants with probable cause.
What's your question?
So, NJVTLO established 2 different exceptions. Are you aware of what those are?
Yeah, there's like the warrant requirement and then like the reasonableness standard.
So as the pro, we're changing from reasonable suspicion to probable cause.
We
that
would
doesn't
argue that
mean that we're necessarily adding warrants. In fact, it is
no, but like most people say that like probable cause would require a warrant.
No, but what we are arguing today is about NJVTLO. Would you agree with me? Has 2 exceptions.
But like
Randall and I are
to
returning
validate probable cause, what the Cornell School of Law tells you is that you need search warrants.
No,
Can I ask you a question?
I'm telling you in the real world
Like,
context.
honestly, you can read this in rebuttal. Can I please ask you a question?
Sure.
Okay, so like your like entire link into your second contention on like criminalization is like the link into this reducing searches.
I'm sorry, can you say that again? Is
your link into your second contention reducing searches?
About criminalization? Yes.
Okay.
We give you the fact that we're going to be reducing searches and we're also going to be seeing suppression of evidence under the exclusionary rule.
Okay.
Now you also talked to me about this idea that zero tolerance policies are going down in the status quo, or they're at the very least stagnant, but they are going to be going up under probable cause, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, and one of the major reasons you say this is because of these ideas of external circumstances are going to pressure schools into implementing these policies. So justify to me why, when you tell me that they're recognizing that they're not effective in the status quo and putting them down, why under probable cause they put in ineffective
right
standards?
now, zero tolerance policies are going down because people realize that they criminalize students. But realize that the Teskey evidence that I read to you in my first warrant of that contention tells you that when you decrease the perception of safety in schools, schools rely on things like zero tolerance policies because they think they increase perceptions of safety, not necessarily about criminalization.
Okay, and then so your second contention is essentially just contingent on your first, in which the perception of safety is going to be decreasing, right?
No.
Because your first contention is explaining why that's going to change.
What?
Your entire first contention is
my first contention is about
why
SROs.
safety and how we're addressing issues of safety are going to actually be
my first contention is about SROs increasing. It's not about like safety.
But then, so you don't justify separately these 2 ideas. We're out of time. We're gonna have to talk about it.
Would you like that?
Yeah, so before I start talking, I see 2 things.
Yeah.
First contention, subpoint C, you talk about legal ramifications, all searches require SROs.
Yep.
Can I just see that?
Yep.
That'll be it for now, I think.
Is it cut card, okay?
PDF.
So you just want to see that first? What was the second one?
I don't think the second right now.
Okay, that's fine. Here, it's just highlighted right here.
Highlighted.
Okay, sorry.
Oh, can we see the qualified immunity evidence from
Is it anyone prep?
No, they asked for it.
Yeah, I know, we were still writing aside.
Yeah, sure. 1 second, let me pull that up. So for this one, I only have the cut card, okay? Like, I don't see the data. That's fine. So right here.
Thank you.
Is everyone ready? The con doesn't provide a framework of their own, so we're going to be extending our own. Whichever side provides a more fair and equitable playing field, both on the education level and on the social mobility level, is going to be winning this round. Going on to their first contention, they talk about SROs and give you 4 reasons why SROs are going to increase. Look to the first, where they talk about constraining teachers. One of the things that you're going to notice, they kind of provide you with like this false dichotomy, where they tell you that like, oh, like the role of police in the status quo has like shrunk over the past few years, and that's why teachers are replacing them, right? One of the things that we're going to be noting is that it doesn't make sense that like the role of police has shrunk in the status quo, like since the NGVTLO, right? If we're raising the standard from reasonable suspicion from in loco parentis in the NGVTLO, like it doesn't make sense that there would be like this correlation. But more importantly, looking for litigation costs, right? We have two rebuttals here. First is like the definition of probable cause in and of itself. What this assumes is that probable cause calls for like a legal determination using legal jargon that teachers wouldn't be like have access to. One of the things that we're going to note is that all probable cause requires is a reasonable decision made by a person, right? It doesn't require like knowledge of various like exigent circumstances, right? All it calls for is a reasonable suspicion. Then we have qualified immunity. What qualified immunity is that as long as someone is not acting intentionally to violate a right, intentionally to violate a constitutional right, and in good faith, right, without racial bias, without any bias whatsoever, they are protected as an employee of the government, acting in good faith of promoting government interests and, more importantly, social safety. Going on to their third warrant, where they talk about legal ramifications. So they basically talk about Pinard, right? We could basically issue an evidence challenge and end this round because they completely lie to you about what Pinard is saying. What Pinard says, quite literally, is only that when currently the probable cause standard is used in schools, it's when police initiate the search. Right? It says that currently, in order for probable cause to be used in schools, police must initiate the search from outside of school. I mean, that evidence is collected outside and then conducted in school simply because they want to know where they are. It does not mean that in a probable cause world that you need police to conduct searches. Completely lying. Going on to their fourth warrant, is we about like the need to employ SROs. Then we look at like a fundamental misunderstanding of NGVTLO and what this round is about. NGVTLO established two very clear exceptions. The first, the warrant exception, right? Because schools are like an area of education and learning, and because there are children that need to be protected, you don't need a warrant, right? That is the first exception. The second was replacing in loco parentis as the federal standard with reasonable suspicion, right? The creation of reasonable suspicion. One of the things that we're going to be noting here is that most importantly, they are not the same thing, right? Overturning reasonable suspicion does not overturn the warrant exception. So like when they're talking about like warrants here, drop it. Then we go on to ZTPs. When they're talking about ZTPs, they give you two reasons why ZTPs are going to rise. The first is pressuring administrators. Now, in order to understand ZTPs, you have to look at where they came from, right? So let's look at that, right? They give you the beginning of ZTPs, where they talk about like in the 80s, when NGVTLO was like going up to the court, all the administrators were like, okay, we can't have this happening because they didn't want to lose power. They had like contentious political debate is what they tell you, right? NPR tells you that zero tolerance policies did not enter the law, like at the federal or state level, until after the Columbine shooting, right? What happened was that after Columbine, perceived safety, parents were so terrified that their kids weren't safe in school that like states and the federal government started granting all of these like administrative and legal powers to schools and, more importantly, the judicial system. That was the impetus for the rise of zero tolerance policies, right? Now, in order to buy this contention, when you talk about like this backlash, you have to buy the fact that perceived safety, like that the fact that like currently probable cause, an abstract legal concept, is going to be like played by the media or by whomever to a point where it is scarier than Newtown or Sandy Hook, right? Because the ACLU and the Atlantic both tell you that zero tolerance policies in the status quo have various legal challenges arranged against them and are currently on the decline. Why? Because Joseph Doyle tells you empirically of the National Bureau of Economic Research that in the status quo, like empirically, because the link between the criminal propensity of students is inelastic to punishment, changing or lowering the punishment level does not influence the criminal violence of students. Because of this, they're abandoning the ZTPs in the status quo, which is why you won't see them rise, because they don't work and they won't turn to them. And for all of these reasons, we affirm. Thank you.
Nine. Opponents ready. Rob, judges, so I'll just be doing an overview, our setting attention, and then down their case. Keeping kids out of jail is the most important issue in the round. They concede this in first crossfire. This is super critical because in the rebuttal, my opponents completely drop the evidence that we read at the end of our first contention from Lozen of the NEPC. They can't respond to it in summary. Don't let them respond to it in final focus. The evidence says that while 5% of juvenile arrests are due to searchable offenses, the other 95% are because of non-searchable offenses. That means that at the end of the day, even if my opponents win their big argument that searches are going to go down, they only change a maximum of 5% of all juvenile arrests. But if we prove to you that things like SROs or zero tolerance policies increase, since they can arrest students for literally any offense, searchable or non-searchable, we access 100% of all total juvenile arrests. This is the easiest impact comparison done in the round, meaning that even if there's a chance that either of our contentions are going to happen, you should be signing a very easy negative ballot. But now let's go to their responses on our second contention about zero tolerance policy. First of all, he tries to say like, oh, where did these zero tolerance policies come from? They came after Columbine. He's literally playing right into our first warrant on scaring administrators. He literally says in rebuttal, word for word, the reason why these zero tolerance policies were implemented in the 1990s was because of this lack of perception of safety. What the ACLU evidence, which they conveniently drop, says is that teachers and administrators really value the search standard as a really good way for maintaining safety within schools. That means when you switch to probable cause and you take away this tool, there is a perceived lack of safety that plays right into the increase in zero tolerance policies. Then he tries to say, oh, alright, so let's just go back down the case. Let's start the first contention about bias. So first of all, recognize that zero tolerance policies link way better into racism. What Rendell of Dayton University says is that these zero tolerance policies are disproportionately affected and put to minorities, meaning that minorities are still impacted under zero tolerance policies. I would say searches are a very small piece of the puzzle, but then zero tolerance policies are going to link a lot better. A on probability, because they read that minorities are suspended 30% more, but you know why that's why that's the case. Ultimately, the reason why the kids are funneled into this school-to-prison pipeline is not the search itself, but it's a punishment. The reason why it has racist implications is because of the zero-tolerance policy. But then on scope, zero-tolerance policies discriminate against every single individual in a school who's ever committed a school infraction, not just the small minority of kids getting searched. The link is literally just that racism stops these bad searches because probable cause is a higher standard. But what Jacoby of Northwestern writes is that when officers are going to be seeing the law is hindering their investigation, they're just going to conduct an illegal search and then redesign the court testimony to make it seem like they had probable cause. But either way, my opponents do not change implicit biases, they concede this. That means that even if searches do decrease, what Bowman of Seattle writes is that when the threshold for searching someone increases, officers are going to take those implicit biases that we both agree happen and hone them in on minorities and focusing on getting more evidence about these minorities. That means that the proportion of searches geared towards minorities stays the same. There's no benefit to racism. But then you can turn this because Wang explains that when you have this level of racism under a supposedly objective standard, it creates a veil of legitimacy for racism in government, breeding complacency. Then their subpoint B is just racism is bad, we can agree. Let's go to the contention 2 on crime. Their subpoint A and their subpoint C are impacts. Subpoint B is literally their only warrants in the contention. Let's talk about that first. First, they say decreasing searches. Remember Jacoby, who says that if officers see the law as hindering their investigation, they're just going to conduct the illegal search, then finesse the facts. The reason for this is that teachers want safety in their classrooms. That means that they really want convictions, so they're going to try as hard as they can to do that. And whether that means conducting an illegal search or not, that's still going to happen. But then, that's why Perry of Lewis and Clark explains that courts are probably going to dilute probable cause to the point where it's functionally reasonable suspicion. There's no real benefit in decreasing searches. But then they talk about this exclusionary rule and suppression of evidence. But first of all, this plays right into our Hirschfield evidence in our first contention. When courts undermine rule authority of teachers, they become a lot more scared of being sued, and that's why they're going to expand the roles of police and external security and school discipline to reduce the vulnerability to these lawsuits. They try to say in Crossfire, oh, there's qualified immunity, but remember that qualified immunity actually goes away. With the Cook evidence that Gaurav reads, gives to them in Crossfire, says that qualified immunity goes away because now you have a much clearer standard under probable cause. But either way, I would argue the qualified immunity only applies if reasonable searches are done on and thrown out on a legal technicality. It doesn't apply to blatantly illegal searches, which is what my opponents are trying to impact to. Then on the contention 3, I would argue that it really doesn't matter about these this rights argument, because I would argue that most kids in this room probably didn't know the difference between reasonable suspicion and probable cause before arguing this topic. Obviously, the suppression of these rights that they're talking about is not happening in the status quo if minorities don't know their rights, and for all these reasons, we're very proud to negate. So long.
Ready for cross?
Yeah, we go first question.
So when we're talking about ZTPs, the motivations of administrators for replacing them, right? In the status quo, the ACLU, which you cite, notes that ZTPs are being decreased because administrators don't realize that they're effective.
Okay, so here's what the ACLU evidence says. It says that 17 states are like changing the zero tolerance policies. I read that evidence. What we're trying to tell you is that like even if zero tolerance policies are going away, it's mostly just like President Obama in a press conference being like, let's not put our kids in jail. What we're saying is like
how does that make any sense?
So here's the distinction.
Statement from the president is not the same as legal challenges.
Here's the distinction, right? The reason why these zero tolerance policies are being limited is not because schools think that zero tolerance policies don't increase safety, it's because they think that criminalizing students is bad. Our argument is that when schools overreact to a shift in probable cause, they're gonna go to safety because that's the most important.
In the states that have already repealed zero tolerance policies.
Okay, these states have not repealed zero tolerance. I want to see that evidence.
Some of them have, right?
Okay,
I think
can I see that
Colorado
evidence?
has, but no, but in this.
Can I see that evidence?
Wait, are you saying that ZTPs are current in every single state?
I'm saying that they haven't been fully repealed.
But
sure.
And so for states that have begun repealing them, do you see an increase in violence, an increase in crime?
I would argue probably not.
No, so that ZTPs don't actually impact on violence and crime?
What? No, we're saying zero tolerance is bad because it leads to arrest. It has nothing to do with like we're not talking about crime here. Like I'm not sure what you're trying to get. Yeah, I do have a question. Okay, so in your subpoint B, actually let's talk about your third contention about like empowering minorities. Right?
Sure.
So first you say that you're like increasing constitutional rights. So,
correct.
Okay, so are like minorities right now saying like, oh, we're being searched under reasonable suspicion. This is really, really bad. Like, do they recognize that?
I would say that when minorities are searched at higher rates, right, they're fundamentally realizing that the police and government are out aligned against them.
So it's contingent on a decrease in searches towards minorities.
Which you concede, yes.
No, I read like 7 responses against that.
Well, when you say that there's going to be, if there's no decrease in searches, right? If there's no decrease in searches, then why are administrators feel like they can't enforce it?
Because the ACLU evidence says that they really value searches.
No, but if
they're not like reading like all the cards that I read in rebuttal. They're just thinking
searches,
like
right?
we decrease, like we change the evidence standard. That probably means there might be less searches.
If administrators value searches, right, and then they lose those searches, that's where you access zero tolerance. But that implies that searches are going down, that they're losing those searches.
They don't need to actually lose those searches to gain our impact. So what Merkway says is just the perception of this lack of safety is what leads to the zero tolerance policies. It's the perception what's most important, not the actual number of searches. The reason for this is that schools don't record the number of searches being conducted in schools. Do you have a question?
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about your response to racism, right? So you talk about this implicit bias.
Yes.
Wouldn't you agree that like when you stop people from searching simply off of bias, even if there's like evidence being gathered that's like racially motivated, which neither world can prevent, right? Wouldn't you agree though that the searches that we are preventing that are based on bias alone is still a benefit, right? We're still preventing those searches.
So first of all, I don't think you're preventing those searches because like what the Bowman evidence is like super explicit about is that since officers still have these implicit biases, they're going to take those biases and hone in on gathering more evidence about minorities.
But they'll only be able to search where there's actual evidence.
I mean, I would argue that like crime rates between like minorities and non-minorities is like probably like pretty similar. Obviously, they're going to be able to find minorities who are like criminals, but it's really unfair to only target minorities for their searches and not non-minorities.
Like prep?
Yeah, we're going to start. Thank you.
Just for a second.
So I'll just be running down their case and then our case and why you should be voting for us. Is everyone ready? Let's begin. So to start off, remember the framework at the top that Randall and I provided you, that we're creating a more fair and more equitable school system for all members of our society. With that in mind, let's go down to the offense that they give you in their own case and that they've been extending throughout the round. They give you 4 main reasons that we're going to see our SROs increasing in schools and why this is really bad. The first 2 have to do with teachers' abilities. Remember what Randall tells you in his rebuttal and what I tell you in the first cross, we talk about the idea of qualified immunity. Now, they tell us that qualified immunity is going to go away for some reason. They offer no justification of why this is the case. With that in mind, extend this response where we tell that because of qualified immunity, teachers are not hindered in any way because they're protected against making honest mistakes. Again, remember that probable cause, by definition, is a reasonable decision made by a reasonable person. It's not difficult to comprehend. It's by nature intended that way. Then let's move on to their third response that they give us, where police officers will be searching students and not teachers, and that's why they're going to increase. This is based on Pernard, and Randall tells you very clearly in rebuttal why this simply isn't the case. They're lying about that piece of evidence. All they tell you is that, oh, police officers are actually supposed to be searching students outside of school, and then if they go into the school, they should continue searching them. Yet, they misconstrue that for you. Don't buy that third justification. Then they give us the warrants. Remember what NJV TLO, there are 2 exceptions. We're only overturning 1, not the warrant exception. This doesn't apply. Then, in their next contention, they give us the fact that there's going to be pressure towards administration and external circumstances. Now, remember, they have to justify to you why events such as the 2012 school shooting at Sandy Hook is actually not as bad as probable cause, right? Because what initiated ZTPs in the 1990s was a school shooting as Columbine. Sandy Hook was a far worse shooting, yet in the status quo, they tell us that zero-tolerance policies are going down or at the very least stagnant. Make them justify to you why probable cause is going to create more of a frenzy among people when we see that they're actually not paying any attention right now. Anyway, with that in mind, let's go down towards our case. We give you the fact that racism, they only respond that, oh, we agree that racism is bad, but remember, Brian, we're talking about internalized racism and the targeting of minority students. That's actually the #1 factor for aggressive behavior. So you actually can turn the point where they tell us that, oh, we're only impacting towards 5% of searches because only 5% lead to convictions, because the whole point is that the search themselves are harmful. All minority students who are searched are damaged as a result of that. At that point, you can extend our contention about criminalization and empowering minority citizens because they have no links towards criminalization anymore, as I explained to you here, yet we're linking into that through racism, and for all these reasons, affirm.
We're on prep starting now. Well said.
Okay, just as a general roadmap, I'm going to be doing weighing at the top, their case, our case. Is everyone ready? Okay, let's begin. Keeping kids out of jail is the most important issue in the round. They concede to us in first crossfire. But realize the most important evidence is at the end of our first contention from Lawson, who tell you that only 5% of all arrests are due to searchable offenses, meaning at best, even if they win this big argument that searches go down, they only affect 5% of the problem. However, things like SROs and zero-tolerance policies affect the entire 100% of all arrests. But let's start off on their first contention about bias, 2 responses that they don't respond to. First from Bowman, who tells you that if officers can't conduct as many searches, they'll just hone in on their bias and target minorities. But B from Wang, he tells you that having racist searches happen under a supposedly higher standard, like probable cause, only furthers to legitimize racism. But secondly, on criminalization, realize that A, Jacoby tells you that officers will just conduct illegal searches, meaning that searches won't actually just decrease, but B, their stuff on the exclusionary rule literally concedes the link into our first contention. I'll get to that later. But lastly on rights, realize that students don't know the difference between reasonable suspicion and probable cause, meaning that there's no change there. But let's go to the main voting issues today's round. The first one's going to be SROs. We'll drop the Pinard evidence. Let's not make this a roundabout evidence. But we access this through our second link on lawsuits. They respond with like qualified immunity, but realize that A, the Cook evidence that I show them literally says that a clear standard like probable cause actually could take away qualified immunity. That's what's really important is the Hirschfield analysis, which tells you that when teachers are scared of being sued, they are forced to rely on external security and SROs. That links us to the Nance card, which tells you that schools with SROs have 1.83 times more arrests for low-level offenses. The second voting issue is zero-tolerance policies. He says that like they didn't enter into Columbine, but realize what's more important is why schools actually implement them. The ACLU evidence is very clear. It tells you that teachers value searches for safety, meaning if you decrease the perception of safety, you decrease the perception of safety when you take away these searches. What Merkway tells you is that historically and empirically, when we have a lower perception of safety, schools rely on things like zero-tolerance policies. That's why what's really important is the Arum evidence, which they never respond to, which tells you that historically, when we expand students' legal rights, it has increased the extent to which schools have relied on authoritarian measures. That's the easiest way that you can vote for the negative in today's round. Thank you.
So let's address this idea of historical precedent, right?
Yeah.
Now, believe it or not, like NGVTLO, reasonable suspicion, as broad and vague as it is in its abstract sense, right, was a step up from in loco parentis, which basically gave school like carte blanche to do whatever they wanted.
I mean, like, I wouldn't say that's true necessarily. It was kind of just like every school could decide what they wanted to do. I wouldn't say like there was like one blanket or like.
But the federal requirement was in loco.
Here, but like what we tell you,
Yeah, but like
They
that,
had more power than they had.
but like a lot of schools kind of just like required warrants, which I would argue would be a higher standard. Like it was like very varied. There was no like universal standard. But
Sure.
yeah.
So let's say they required warrants,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
Well, like the federal standard, by and large, was in loco parentis.
What is
Yeah.
After that, where we saw where in loco parentis was in effect, which was the majority of schools, right?
Is there a
Where did we
question?
see like the rise of punitive policy?
No. What, like the TLO case literally said is that you only need reasonable suspicion. You tell me yourself that that's basically saying you don't really need evidence,
No,
right?
no. So your evidence that says like your historical precedent evidence,
yeah,
right?
So
what? Give me an exact historical
Yeah,
example.
so sure.
Like,
So
what is
like-
your reference?
yeah, so after the courts gave like students due process rights in the 70s, we saw a huge increase in authoritarian and disciplinary measures. That's one example
Such
that
as
Aaron talks about.
What?
I think like at least in schools, like harsher disciplinary measures, like harsher
Things like
punishments.
zero tolerance policies, things
Zero-
like general searches,
I mean,
things
like,
like SROs.
They don't have to be called like this is a zero tolerance policy. You can have like harsher disciplinary measures, harsher punishments. Like that's what happened with due process.
Admittedly, that's also in a far different criminal environment than we have today, right? I mean, crime on the whole in the 70s.
So you just
was far
asked for
higher
a
and it was
historical
far
example. I
greater
gave you one, and then now you're like, oh, history doesn't matter.
No, I'm just asking for historical accuracy.
Okay.
Okay, alright, let's
You
talk
want a
about your
question?
first contention on bias. So like all racist searches go away.
No. So that's
No, that's not what we said. Wait, we're talking about mitigating racism.
Yeah, I understand, but do all searches go away? Do all racist searches go away?
no, of course not. Right? So you talk about implicit
Sure.
bias, and we basically say, okay, even if you buy implicit bias, right, they're only going to be able to search when there's evidence.
No, but what we tell you from the Bowman analysis, which you guys literally never respond to, says that if officers actually can't search as many students, the only people that they're actually going to try to scope out evidence for and actually create probable cause for are those minorities that they're already biased against. That's what you tell me.
You can't necessarily create probable cause, right? That's the whole
No,
point.
like
You're
the-
raising the
So,
evidentiary standard.
here's the analysis I gave in like my second crossfire. I'll do it again, right? Like minorities and like non-minorities have like approximately the same crime rates. Obviously, you can find a student who's committing crime. They're just gonna focus on gathering crime on like evidence on minorities committing crime. I would say it's super unfair to not focus on like everyone as a whole.
So you're suggesting that those minorities aren't already being searched under reasonable suspicion?
No, we're saying that like since now they're just like because like probable cause requires them to get more evidence, now they have to focus all like a lot more attention on minorities, which trades off with like that searching like everyone in general. So like I would say there's like a greater proportion of
Yeah,
minority
because you tell me that
searches.
they can search less people, so the only people they'd actually want to search are the people that they are already biased against. That's what you guys tell us.
Yeah, but we're still decreasing bias searches only, searching only on bias.
I would argue that the proportion stays the same, and that's what matters most for
Alright,
racism.
That's guesswork. We're on the rest of our prep.
Yeah. How much prep do we have left?
I have folks with 30 seconds left.
Is everyone ready? Framework is basically the same on both sides. It links into equitable education. Going on to the first voting point, which is reasons to vote for the con rate. First, we talk about the SROs. They give us basically two warrants for SROs that last into their summary. The first is that teachers are going to be scared, right? Extend Owen's responses in the summary. The first being the definition of probable cause calls for a reasonable determination. The second being the qualified immunity, right? As long as you are not violating a constitutional right with the intent to violate that right, and you do so in good faith, you're not going to be prosecuted. Moving on to the warrant requirement, right? Again, extended the response of NG GBTLO, two completely different exceptions. We're not looking towards warrants. Then go into ZTPs, which is what their biggest point in the round. They basically tell you that like administrators and parents, because of perceived safety, are going to increase ZTPs. One of the things that we're going to look towards is that the rise of ZTPs occurred after Columbine, right? Then when we saw Sandy Hook and Newtown, we didn't see ZTPs increase. Instead, we see a trend in the status quo against ZTPs. What this means is that the impetus of Newtown and Sandy Hook, that tragedy, was not enough to reverse the trend of ZTPs. You have to buy into the fact that probable cause is scarier to parents, scarier to administrators, than the fact that perceived safety is at its lowest point. Then you go into voting point 2, which is reasons to vote for the pro, primarily racism, which is going to link into criminalization and minority rights. When they talk about the 95% thing, they try to limit our impact to the 5%. One of the things that we tell you, they literally concede, like, quote, if they can't conduct the same number of searches in their own evidence, right? The number of searches is going down. They try to argue proportionality, but it's basically guesswork, and what we actually look towards is that the bias-only searches inevitably are going to go down, right? From that, what we see is Bryant and internalized racism, which is that even if they're not convicted, even if they're not accused of anything, the fact that they are being searched with no evidence or right against them creates internalized racism. Bryant tells us that internalized racism is the biggest predictor for violence, which is how we link into the 95% and criminalization, right? Which, because 95% of the crimes are violence crimes, and because the unnecessary bias searches create violence that is manufactured, we create a system in which people are being prosecuted for actions that are being enforced in that environment, manufactured by an environment that dismisses their rights, which is how we link to criminalization. For all of these reasons, we affirm. Thank you.
We're on the rest of our questions now. Ready? Rob, 3 judges. I'll just be doing a quick weighing and then I'll just sign for some voters. Keeping kids out of jail is the most important impact in today's round. They really never respond to the weighing analysis. We've extended it at the top of every single speech in the round. They try to say, oh, equitable education is going to be a lot more important. But recognize at the point where a student is literally taken out of a school and thrown into juvenile detention, they can't gain access to that education whatsoever. It doesn't matter how equitable it is if they don't even have access to it and they're sitting around in juvie. But then remember Lozen, who's super important, who says that they at most, my opponents only impact to the 5% of arrests. At the point where we're valuing arrests the most important in today's round, the maximum impact that they can have to this is the 5% of arrests that are due to searchable offenses. We impact to 100% if we increase either SROs or zero tolerance policies. But let's start with their extension of racism very quickly. They drop 2 really important terms. First, Bowman says is that since officers have these implicit biases in both worlds, they're just going to focus those implicit biases on gathering more evidence about minorities, meaning the proportion doesn't change. They try to say, in final focus, this new analysis about how the search itself is a lot more important. But they drop Jacoby, who also extends to a summary, who says that officers, when they see the laws hindering their investigation, are just going to conduct more illegal searches and then finesse the facts to make it seem like they have probable cause. There's literally no change in the number of searches. But now let's go to criminalization. First on SROs, his only, Gaurav really cleanly extends this lawsuit's warrant. Their only response is, oh, officers are going to have qualified immunity in both worlds, but they drop Cook, and Cook is very, very explicit. He says that qualified immunity only applies when there is no clearly established law. We're telling you that when you institute probable cause, a much clearer standard, you strip qualified immunity, and that's how we gain access to Hirschfield. Hirschfield says that when teachers are scared of these lawsuits and they're scared of their vulnerability to being sued under a much clearer standard, that's when they shift to things like SROs. We get a really nice Nance impact who says that now we increase juvenile arrest rates by 1.83 times because these police officers have to arrest for literally every single offense while teachers have discretion and teachers can make these crimes a learning experience. But then on zero tolerance policies, extend administrator fear, their only response to this is they're this didn't happen until Columbine, but he literally concedes in his rebuttal that it was safety perception. ACLU says that teachers really value this evidence standard. At the end of the day, Aram gives the best analysis in the round who says that historically, when you increase student rights, you increase authoritarian measures. Thank you.